Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, Tom.
What do you call a bunch of guys in Ukraine shooting at government agents with their own guns?
Freedom fighters?
Right-wing, alt-right lunatics.
Oh, if you're the progressive media, that's certainly true.
Man, wouldn't it be great to see some images of those buffoons from January 6th last year versus some images from the Russian army? Right, because these things are described as very. I mean, one is a domestic, allegedly a domestic insurrection. The other is an invasion. But they're discussed in terms, right? They were both really serious threats trying to topple the government.
If you ask the Russians, it's a civil war. I mean, this is a civil engagement.
Right,
this is not a foreign territory. So,
right.
I mean, who knows what people would think?
But the really big difference is, in one case, there are troops marching in with tanks and rockets and guns and bombs. And in the other case, you had some goofballs taking selfies.
Right.
That's the really big difference between the two.
The January 6th things felt more like a frat party gone rogue or a bit of a...
Right. Nobody, no reasonable person, for one moment, thought that those clowns on January 6th were actually going to topple any government. Nobody. Will the Russians topple governments in Ukraine? Maybe. Nobody knows yet, for sure. It's very much within the realm of possibility.
You know, the one story I've heard that has made this almost as humorous as January 6th, and that's a horrible thing to say because it's not. What Russia's doing is completely uncalled for. But the one thing that has made this humorous to me, it has been reported widely that Russian soldiers, many are dead set against this whole thing, right? You have a lot of soldiers who are following orders, but they're going in and we're hearing about mass numbers of deserters, right? And they're just looking, okay, I'm going in, I'm being told to go in, and then they're just deserting. A lot of them are using Tinder. A lot of these Russian soldiers are getting on Tinder when they get into the Ukraine, and they're finding Ukrainian women to go spend their time with, to go hide out with while they're deserting their army.
Well, Dave, as long as they're all wearing masks, then I'm sure it will be okay. You know, I actually didn't think we were going to start laughing. There's some really gravely serious things going on in the world, and I don't want anyone to think we don't think that's serious. But, you know, at the same time, sometimes when there are grave, serious things going on, that's the best time to laugh a little bit. I've been chuckling to myself recently, thinking about the world seems so enamored with bureaucratic organizations issuing edicts and enforcing executive orders and these kinds of things. Why doesn't either the United States CDC or the Ukrainian equivalent of the CDC just issue an executive order and say, look, there's a pandemic going on right now. We can't have an invasion. We can't have a war. That is a violation of regulation. Wouldn't that just solve the problem?
Tom, you're making it really hard not to make jokes about this because this actually came out from the CDC yesterday.
Yeah.
So, you know, Putin has now started talking about nuclear warfare.
Yes.
I don't know how many people have seen that.
Right.
I say yesterday, it came out Monday. As Putin has talked about nuclear warfare, the CDC has put out guidelines of what to do if there is an actual nuclear threat that people are instructed to go to bomb shelters.
Right.
And included in that nuclear threat, and this is Americans, this is not Ukrainians.
Right.
If there is a nuclear threat and Americans are recommended to go to bomb shelters, they are still recommended to stay 6 feet apart. In the event of a nuclear attack on the United States, don't forget to stay 6 feet apart.
Don't forget your social distancing.
And wear your masks.
Yeah.
I mean, priorities.
But there again, Dave, I think that's impossible because we all know that nuclear war is bad for the environment. And I'm quite certain that the UN has outlawed such things because it would be a form of pollution.
Right.
We can't have polluters. That's bad for the environment.
Right. And John Kerry has told us as much. John Kerry is more concerned about the environmental impact of this war than the death of hundreds of Ukrainians, or what might end up being thousands of Ukrainians. What we've seen some of the video has been horrific.
Right.
I mentioned earlier, just a few minutes ago, that there are a lot of people involved in this war who don't want this war.
Right.
There are a lot of people who are actually soldiers on both sides, right? I mean, you have all these Ukrainian citizens. I've seen videos of people from Poland and Belarus and some of these other countries as well. They're making their way into Ukraine to fight alongside their Ukrainian friends.
Right.
These are not soldiers. These are freedom fighters. These are people just defending their homes, their families, their livelihoods, their country, their right to a democratically elected government, all of those types of things. And at the same time, you have many on the Russian side. We've been seeing mass demonstrations of Russian citizens saying, we don't want this. This is not a war any of us are in favor of. It's really the government's, right? You have a Russian tyrant in Vladimir Putin sitting there saying, I don't care what my people want.
Right.
I don't, this is not up to them. This is up to me. And I want to rebuild the Soviet Union. So I'm going to move forward on this. And it's going to start, we started with Georgia in 2006.
When George W. Bush was president.
Right.
Yeah.
So 2006 or 2004, I
something
believe.
Like that. Yeah.
Something like that. He invades and retakes
then
control of Georgia, puts a Russian friendly person in charge, then Crimea under Obama. And now under Biden, we have what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But the people don't want it. And it points out sort of this problem of what happens when a government has too much power. A government is exceeding the power given to it by its people.
Yep.
Like we talked about last week, we talked about this dichotomy of we the people versus we the government, and where do your rights come from? Now you have this same dichotomy of you have governments who have made decisions and taken actions for the last 14, 20 years, really since the fall of the Soviet Union, that are affecting people, are destroying families, are leading to death.
Yeah.
And none of the people actually wanted it. It was just, it's all about government power.
And if you're a Russian, right, what preceded that? And the answer is, well, the Soviet Union, right? So it was something very bad. You know, I trying to compare, and I've been reading art, you know, trying to get my mind around exactly what Russia is today. I mean, it's a thoroughly corrupt government, a regime. The Soviet Union, of course, was thoroughly corrupt and unjust, and, well, as Ronald Reagan said, an evil empire.
Yep.
Rightfully so. And, you know, if you really want to be now we're going to go from light, fun things to deadly serious things. You really want to be a radical today. Start whispering about revolution in Russia.
Yeah.
Start teaching Russians the principles of the Declaration of Independence. You know, encourage something like a Russian, you know, Tiananmen Square, but that goes in a different, you know, in a different way, because the numbers would be so overwhelming, where you have Russians saying, look, this government of ours, it's violating our rights. It's now invading other nations and violating the rights of other people, foreigners, and we don't consent to this. This isn't just. We've tried to petition. We've tried various redresses. Elections don't seem to don't seem to rein in our government, and therefore we conclude nothing less than revolution. Now, I don't know that conversation is going on, but it could.
It could.
Arguably, it should. And, you know, this brings us a couple of important points about this whole mess that we see in Ukraine. I wanted to make for our listeners, for our members. One is this, I want to be very clear, and sometimes I've been accused before of having a tin ear, and this might be a moment where I have a tin ear. Maybe I'm not hearing things correctly. I know there is tremendous support for Ukraine, and certainly in this particular conflict, I side with Ukraine. I do not think Russia is justified. There are people making arguments, some pretty good arguments. People like old Pat Buchanan is still around, and he's no fan of Russia. But the argument he's making is, look, America has gone, but we made certain promises that we wouldn't get NATO powers too close to Russia, and we have betrayed some of those promises, that Russia is looking out for its own interests. It doesn't want a bunch of NATO powers surrounding it, and I understand all that. I still don't think that justifies Russia rolling into Ukraine for this simple matter. There's an ancient theory of war called the just war doctrine. And in some versions, it's very complicated and requires a lot of moral logic, right? And thinking through, because nations, how to conduct yourself rightfully or justly with regard to another, it's different than individuals, right? I don't have there's no situation where I can violently strike you if you've not done anything to me as an individual. But what happens when a nation is lining up an army and rockets and right across your border, and they've made it known their whole purpose is to use that. Once they get it all in place, they want to attack you and kill you, right? In that case, do you have to wait till you're hit first before you punch back, so to speak? Anyway, this classical natural justice theory of war, here's what it boils down for me. No matter how many NATO nations are surrounding Russia, and no matter how close they get, those NATO nations will not stop Russia from being a just regime. If Russia wants to engage in justice, if it wants to protect the rights of its own citizens, if it wants to, treat other nations fairly and openly, and NATO nations aren't going to stop Russia from doing that. The reason Russia doesn't want NATO close to it is for unjust purposes. Right. It wants to have the freedom to engage in nefarious, unjust business. It reminds me in part, there are many very important differences. So I don't want, my friend Ross Kaminsky always jokes that he's the king of the bad analogy club. And I often think I'm right there. I'm his vice president. I'm his vice king. I'm his queen. I'm right there. I'm really bad at bad analogies. So this analogy is not perfect. There are many really important differences, but it does remind me of the cause of the Confederacy in this regard. The Confederate States of America talked a lot about they wanted independence. They wanted freedom. They didn't want to be subjected. It was their whole argument for seceding from the United States. And I would always ask the question, well, what do they want the freedom to do?
Right.
What's the goal? What's the end? And what they wanted the freedom to engage in great injustice, to have a regime of slavery. That's why they didn't want any influences around. I sort of see Russia in the same way. So on balance, I see this as an unjust invasion into Ukraine. And at the same time, this is the part about my tin ear. I don't want our members to be disillusioned that Ukraine is some model of morality.
Yeah.
It is a terribly, terribly corrupt, oligarchic kind of regime. It runs on cronyism. And to the degree that many American crony political elites, right, have gotten involved with Ukraine for that very reason. Cronies tend to attract cronies. There's a reason when Joe Biden is looking around for corrupt regimes to launder U.S. tax dollars into bank accounts of his family. Where does he go? He goes to Ukraine. So I just want to say those two things. I think it's an unjust invasion. I think that many of the parties involved none of them are models of morality. Not Ukraine, not NATO, not the United States, not the regime, the governing class of the United States. And the final sort of serious point I want to make is none of this would be happening if Ukraine was armed to the teeth with weapons of national defense the way that it once was. Yep. It once was armed to the teeth, and none of this would be happening. There were all kinds of, arguments made and strategic thinking and various experts saying, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we can't, what had happened after the Soviet Union, the Soviets had placed a bunch of nuclear tipped ICBM and other tactical missiles in Ukraine. And both, Russia, the United States, as well as the UK, for various reasons, they didn't want those nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And so they made an agreement, and Ukraine agreed to get rid of all those weapons with the agreement that the United States, among others, would come to the defense of Ukraine if Ukraine really needed it. Now here they sit, and they can't defend themselves. And it drives home for me the really simple. I think when some people think about these subjects, they think, well, you have to be a great expert in foreign policy and international relations, right, and all the. And there's, I don't want to dismiss. I mean, we do want people who know these things and know history. And yes, there's a room for that. But there are also certain things that are really simple. Here's one of those simple things. The world is a really dangerous place.
Yeah.
It's really, it always has been, it always will be. And whether you are an individual person or you're a nation, it's wise to realize the world is dangerous, and you should be able to defend yourself, whatever that requires, whatever that means.
Whether that's as an individual or as a nation.
All right.
As an individual, you should be able to defend yourself from other individuals and from your government. And as a government, you should be able to, as a nation,
right,
you should be able to defend yourself from other nations. And that's where this all started. It's interesting, and I don't want to spend too much time belaboring this topic. I think it's such a fluid moving situation, and there's so many other people who are experts in foreign affairs, and you don't have to be. I think our goal here today is just to lay that sort of philosophic, theoretical foundation of how the founders would approach this, how good citizen thinkers with civic knowledge would approach this, and let people analyze and view the news from there. But you brought up something that's really interesting that I hadn't thought about until you said it, and that was we talked about the Ukraine being attacked by Russia. May
I make one little correction?
Sure.
Ukraine, not the Ukraine.
You're right. When did that happen? It's one of those countries that everybody
during the Cold War. So, and I know I know very, very little Russian, but in Russian, when they would refer to that territory, the Russian object was translated as the Ukraine. And so it's a very Soviet way of referring to Ukraine. It says the Ukraine.
It's like us referring to the South.
Yes.
We don't say we don't say South. We just say the South, and everybody knows what we're talking about.
As if it's a territory, a part of the United States. Which part of the United States you're talking about? Oh, I'm talking about the South, right? As a part of the United States. So the Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union.
It all goes back to the same thing. I've been having trouble getting used to hearing it called Kyiv instead of Kiev.
Yes,
Kiev is the Russian pronunciation. I understand that, but you go back.
And I just love the chicken dish, which I always say.
See, for me, it's Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof takes place in Kiev.
Yes.
So I grew up with that.
Yep.
And speaking of, I kind of wanted to tie this to Israel for a minute.
Sure.
You talked about how Russia, the United Kingdom, the United States went in during the Budapest Agreement and said 1994, Bill Clinton at the helm of this agreement, of this negotiation, convinces the Ukraine to take away, to get rid of the nuclear arsenal that the Russians had left in. I did it again. I will stop. It's not intentional and it's not meant with any.
Yeah, I get it.
They went in and told Ukraine, you need to give up these weapons. And they convinced them, and they said, we're going to be there and we're going to take care of you. And it's eerily similar to 1967 and 1973 in Israel.
Oh, yeah.
In 1967, for those who don't know, Israel fought what was the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. And what made that war interesting, it's so similar to what Ukraine is going through today, in that Ukraine knew the Russians were attacking. Ukraine was
they could see them, right?
They could see them surrounding the border.
Yeah.
And yet they didn't act until fired upon.
Yeah.
In 1967, Israeli intelligence finds both, it was either the Syrians or the Lebanese, the Jordanians and the Egyptians. So 3 different fronts on this tiny little country of Israel, all putting military along the borders. And all 3 countries are saying, oh, we're just running military exercises.
If we were to compare Israel in terms of physical size, what state would be
Rhode Island? Maybe.
I know it's small, but it's that small.
It's that small.
Okay.
You can fit 9 Israels into the state of Colorado. For those who know Colorado, you can fit 9 Israels into the state of Colorado.
Okay.
So you have this country, this tiny little country with militaries gearing up on 3 different borders, which Ukraine was facing as well. And Israel is saying, goes to the United States, goes to the United Kingdom and says, we're about to be attacked. And all these other countries saying, no, these are military exercises. We heard the same thing from Putin. And they said, no, you can't, don't attack. Israel says, no, we're not waiting. We are going to get destroyed. And they go and they attack all 3 fronts. And they beat all 3 armies in 6 days because they attacked first. They knew it was coming. They attacked first before their air defense could get destroyed, before everything else could get destroyed. And what happened? The United States and the United Kingdom came down on them with harsh sanctions, with harsh penalties, made them give up the spoils of war, made them apologize on the international stage, led to all kinds of different agreements and different negotiations. 6 years later, same countries start doing the same thing. Israel this time is a little more hesitant. We don't want to upset anybody. They go back to the United Kingdom, the United States. Hey, we got to do something, or you guys are going to have to come over here and help us. And they said, nope, these are military exercises. Don't do anything unless you're fired upon. The 3 days following the start of the 1973 war were the bloodiest in Israeli history. More Israeli soldiers and Israeli citizens died on those 3 days than all military engagements in Israel combined. And it ended up it was also one of the longest active military engagements that was a true declaration of war. It took 2 weeks for Israel to fight back, push back these armies. And Ukraine is going through something similar now. They didn't want to upset the apple cart. They didn't want to upset the major powers and the major players in the world and the people who think they have a right to tell other countries how to protect themselves.
Well, and I would add, everything you're saying is absolutely true. That there's very real politic in that sense, and it kind of goes back to that natural law doctrine I was talking about. This gets really difficult just from in the interest of moral clarity. When it's an individual one-on-one, right? You know, someone can be saying things you don't like, and even yelling at you, calling you names. That still doesn't really justify hitting them, right? Engaging in violence. But when it comes to nations and you see someone lining up, amassing an army and weapons, and you know what their purpose is, but they haven't done anything yet. I mean, serious thinkers have been trying to flesh this question out. Are you morally justified to launch an attack when you haven't yet been attacked or not? All I want to say about that is there's no obvious clear answer to that.
I agree there's no obviously clear answer, but if you take it back to that individual situation of somebody yelling at you, somebody screaming at you, what if somebody's holding a gun? And looking at you and screaming at you? What if somebody's holding a knife and looking at you and screaming at you? The threat level is another level.
Absolutely.
There is a significantly higher threat there that it is not inconceivable to call that self-defense.
In fact, I mean, when you really break this down, and here we're getting into the weeds of sort of moral and political philosophy.
That's what we do in Plato's Cave.
Well, it's true. I mean, what happens if someone's holding a gun and yelling at you, and they're angry? They seem like they want to attack you. What happens when they raise the gun and start to point it at you? Now, they still haven't hurt you. They're just pointing the gun at, right? Like, do you have to wait till the bullet enters your own body to say, oh, now I've been attacked. Now I can, right? At what point in that sequence of events, from someone yelling at you to pulling out a gun to aiming the gun to firing the gun, right? At what point in there is it right to say, I am now going to defend myself? Because it's foolish. And, here's where certain thinkers like Machiavelli come along and bring tremendous clarity. Whether you think his argument is moral or not is one thing. It's certainly very clear, and it's very prudent and very wise. And that is to take the gun away before the guy even gets a chance to pull it out. The Israelis acted in ways that Machiavelli would say, that's smart. That's a smart thing to do.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's an easy way to transition off of this topic, but it would have been inappropriate of us to avoid it altogether.
Sure.
I think it was worth talking about. And I think if our members would like, we can find some other ways to continue to discuss it. And it's a great thing to start as a discussion on the website.
Well, and likely by the time this is published, things are happening so quickly, right? There's so much to say. And then there's the whole realm of the actual military tactics, weaponry of both sides. Those are things neither of us, right? There are people who actually know a lot about those things, and that's not us. And I would encourage our members who really do know a lot of those kinds of details to chime in. It might help shed some light.
Absolutely. What I really wanted to get us started on today and really start a longer conversation that I I suspect is going to take a few of these weeks to cover.
Yeah.
Is this month's case study that goes along with an article that you had published Tuesday on thehill.com.
Right.
And that's about individual businesses' rights to do business with whoever they want.
Yes.
And what really is private property.
Yes. Yeah. The sort of my angle on this is I like the phrase public accommodation laws. Sometimes they're called anti-discrimination laws. Sometimes they're called civil rights legislation. And that's part of what I try to clarify in that piece that was published in The Hill, although it's really challenging in 700 words to clarify anything. The case study is going to be able to parse this out at more length. And I hope some of our members use this case study this month in their chapter meetings and also within the website there. They can use the activity, feed, the news feed to, and the forums as well to strike up some conversations about this. All this has returned to the spotlight because we have another one of these court cases. It's going to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just a few days ago granted certiorari in a case that involves, it's a woman who owns a website design business. She makes websites, and she wants to make websites for people's weddings. And she's already made it clear she does not want to make websites for certain kinds of weddings, for same-sex weddings that goes against her religious views. And the rub is we have laws. 45 states have state laws, and we have federal laws, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title II of it, that say certain businesses are public accommodations, and as a public accommodation, you may not discriminate against, you may not refuse service to someone based on certain criteria, race, sex, things like this. And there's the rub, right? So we have a law that says if you're going to run a business, you are going to engage in transactions with certain people. And then you have individuals who say, but there's certain trades I don't want to engage in. There's certain exchanges. There's certain work that I just don't want to do. In these things, right? Nobody's claiming any right to injure somebody else, to steal from them, to hit them, right? No like obvious violations of rights. They all involve certain people wanting to decline. Just say, no, thank you. I'm not interested in doing certain things. And this usually is framed as contests between religious liberty, or in this case, that's going to the Supreme Court, free speech, right? Or some combination of the two, free speech and religious liberty, versus these so-called anti-discrimination laws. How can they be reconciled? And what we're trying to show people is they can't be reconciled. At the end of the day, they cannot be reconciled. And it's also a little misleading to put all this emphasis on religious liberty and free speech. So in these cases, most of them, but not all, I want to mention some interesting exceptions. Many of these cases do involve people with certain religious convictions saying, there are things I don't want to do, like make a website, or in the case of Jack Phillips, make a cake that celebrates a same-sex marriage because that goes against my religious views. And so these always get framed as religious matters that only apply to religious believers. And on its face, I have a problem with that, because either the law should be able to command what citizens do with their own property, or the law should not. It really should, as fellow citizens, it shouldn't matter what anyone's religious views are. If that's wrong for the laws to command someone what they must do with their property, then that should go for all citizens. There was a case several years ago, and I found this one actually slightly amusing. There's a bar that is famous for catering to not just to gay men, homosexual men, but a certain kind of homosexual men. Apparently, they call themselves bears, right? Meaning, large, burly, man. That's what the bar is known for. That's who tends to go to this bar. And one evening, a guy shows up dressed in drag. He's dressed he's a cross-dresser. He's dressed as a woman, and they wouldn't let him in. And at first they said, well, he didn't match his photo ID because this photo, right? But that wasn't really what was going on. What was really going on was, this is a place where the owner wanted this for burly,
right,
gay bears, I guess is the lingo. I don't know if I'm using these phrases right or not. And this guy dressed up like a woman didn't fit in, so he just didn't want to admit him in. I bring this case up because it had nothing to do with anyone's religious belief.
Mm-hmm.
No one was talking about Christianity or Judaism or none of that. It was two different groups, and one said, I don't want people like that coming into my business.
Simplify that even more. I mean, I lived in New York and Miami for a while.
Yeah.
I think a lot of our members knew that. And in New York and Miami, you have a wide variety of types of bars and clubs, right? It's not small town where you get like your 5 bars in town and everybody goes to one of the 5 and that's just that. Like it was when I lived in Boulder. I mean, even Boulder doesn't have that many places to go out.
Right.
And in New York and Miami, there are a lot of clubs and bars that have dress codes. And if you're not dressed in a certain way, if you don't have the right kind of, if you're wearing tennis shoes, you're not allowed in. If you're wearing jeans, you're not allowed in. If you are not wearing a button-down shirt or a coat, what if they have some that have sport coat for men? All of these restrictions, and nobody makes a big deal out of it until somebody comes along. And what if they said, this is only for gay men who do this?
Right.
Well, then do we start having a problem? And there's really no difference. The person was dressed in drag and they said, that's not the style we want in our bar.
Yeah.
We want to cater to a certain type of gay man. We want people to know what to expect. This is something that goes back to fundamentals of branding. You want your customer, you want your audience to know exactly what to expect from your brand, from your establishment, from your business every time they hear from you.
Yeah.
It's something that you and I focus on with Plato's Cave, with everything we do. You know what you're going to get from us on a regular basis. And that's what this business wanted.
Yeah.
And why is that wrong?
Well, and so we've come out and taken a position that's unusual and perhaps controversial. And that is we've made the argument these public accommodation laws, it's time for them to go away. It's time for them to be repealed. And there are a number of states similar to Colorado where they have these public accommodation laws, anti-discrimination laws. And then what they do is they create bureaucratic organizations to go enforce them. Right. In Colorado, we have the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. They're unelected bureaucrats who are appointed by the governor, and they're the ones who hear these complaints and try to resolve them. At the federal level, we have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was created by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I want to talk a little bit about the basic problems, why they should go away, and give some of the larger framework of how these things came to be. So the bottom line is a lot of confusion springs from a deep confusion about what civil rights even are.
Sure.
We throw that term around. If someone walks into, a Jack Phillips cake shop and says, I want a certain kind of cake, and Jack says, I don't want to bake that kind of cake, there are people who say, that's a violation of my civil rights. No, it's not. That represents a gross misunderstanding of what a civil right is. A civil right are rights. Now, civil rights are different from natural rights in that natural rights are rightful claims we have by our nature.
Right.
Natural rights don't require any laws, no regulations, no judges, no courts, no Congresses, no anything. We have a natural right in a state of nature with no government at all. We still have it's still wrong, even in a state of nature. If you and I get stranded on an island, Dave, and there's no government, there's no law, and you murder me, that's still wrong.
Yes.
I still have a rightful claim to my life, and you don't have a right to take it. Civil rights do require laws. They are rights created within civil society typically by a civil legislature or a civil government. And those civil rights are the ways citizens participate in their own government, the government they created, the government they have authorized. So laws explaining the right to vote, right? We can say, well, everyone has a natural right to consent, but how do we exercise that right to consent? Well, you do it by voting. Well, how do we vote? Well, that's going to require some laws. We're going to have to decide when elections are going to be held and how are they going to be held? Are we going to use ballots to vote, right? And how are the ballots going to be designed? who is eligible. Can a little child, show up and vote? Can a felon, vote from prison? These kinds of decisions have to be made. So there are laws in place about voting, about running for office. Every citizen should be able to stand for office, as long as they meet the age requirements and they live in the right area and that sort of thing.
Well, and those requirements are determined by a proper consent of the governed as well.
Yes,
right. I mean, it's not as if some being is coming in and saying, okay, we're going to give you the right to run for office, but you have to meet all these requirements that I personally am deciding for you.
Right.
It's the consent of the governed who's coming in and saying, okay, we're going to come up with our civil rights that we all can agree on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we the people, for example, at a national level, we made a decision. You're not eligible for the House of Representatives unless you're at least 25 years old. You're not eligible to be a United States senator unless you're a little older, presumably, hopefully a little wiser, right? You have to be a minimum of 30 years, so on and so forth. These are civil rights properly understood, the way citizens participate in civil society,
Sure.
and in particular within their civil government. You have a right to your house, to your papers, to your possessions. So government may not just burst into your house and take your stuff and search your stuff. They have to have a warrant. If they don't have a warrant, they don't get to come into your house. The civil rights are all connected to the government. Suppose a government prosecutor accuses you of a crime.
Right.
Well, then you have a civil right to a trial by jury, right? A jury of your peers. Some of your fellow citizens get to sit and listen to this. If you have been injured by a fellow citizen and you want to sue so that person has to pay for the damages or something, well, the government provides a civil court system where you can go and sue in these things. All these are civil rights. Nobody has a civil right to command a fellow citizen to engage in a trade with them.
Right.
That's just not no matter how you dice it up, cut it up, there is no civil right to force Jack Phillips to bake a cake for you or to force this woman, I'm trying to remember her name, Lori, can't remember her last name.
It's 303 Creative.
303. Nobody has a civil right to command 303 Creative to make a website for them.
Well, you just said a key word very, very quickly while you were going through that, and that I think we need to zero in on, and I'd like to spend some time on, and that is the word trade. This transaction between 303 Creative and one of their customers, between Jack Phillips and one of his customers, between the Wrangler gay bar and their customer.
Yeah.
That is a trade. It is not a purchase. We have this, we have been trained to think about this completely wrong, that the business has some obligation to the purchaser.
Yeah.
But the purchaser has no obligation to the business.
Yeah.
And that is the fundamental problem that is leading people to think public accommodation laws are okay. So
it's huge. You're absolutely right.
And this is in the case study. This is in your article. And I think it's so critical for people to understand money, cash, whether it's in your bank and you're paying through a debit card or a credit card, or you're paying through trade of goods, right?
Yeah.
You say, I'll do a website for you if you'll come move boxes for me.
Yeah.
It doesn't change. It's still a trade of value.
Yes.
I can do something that you value. I have something that you value. You have something that I value, and we're willing to trade. It's the fundamental aspect of Western civilization.
So what we typically call a purchase or a sale really is a trade or an exchange. And for it to be legitimate, it should be mutually voluntary, right?
Right.
Both parties should agree that they want to make this trade. If either party says, "Yeah, I'm not interested. That trade I don't find it satisfying. I don't want to trade," then no trade should happen. This has been something I've been thinking this through for many years. It is fascinating to me how when property changes forms, many people will assign different moral meanings and moral obligations to it. So if I have a stack of cash right here, I think everyone would agree that is my property. That belongs to me. And I can go out and I might decide I want to spend some of it. And maybe I drive by one store and I say, I'm not going to go spend my cash at that store because the owner of that store is stinky. He just stinks. I don't want to be around because he's stinky.
Yeah.
Now, have I discriminated? Yes, I have. I have just discriminated against stinky people in favor of sweet-smelling people. And maybe I drive by another store and I think I'm not going to use my cash at that store because the owner is, I don't know, an Irish Catholic, and I don't like Irish Catholics. Have I discriminated? Yes, I have. And yet most Americans would say, well, that's your cash. Tom, you get to decide where you spend it, if you spend it, how much of it you want to spend. You get to make that decision. But what happens if I go and I trade my cash for a brick building,
right,
and some eggs and flour and sugar and some ovens, and I say, I'm going to start baking cakes? And that's still my property, right? It just changed form. It's still my property, and yet now people say, well, whoa, hold on, Tom. If it's cakes and flour and eggs and sugar and ovens and a brick building, then we're going to tell you with whom you have to trade.
There's two important things there. First is, not only are you discriminating when you're making purchases, and most people say that's okay, today in our very progressive world, it's being encouraged. How many ads do you see on television? Buy from Black businesses, buy from the Hispanic community, buy from this community, buy from women-owned businesses. They are actively advocating for discrimination in broad daylight, and nobody says anything as long as it's the purchaser.
Let's drill one level down into that particular point. That I mentioned before, we have this deep confusion about civil rights. We also have a deep confusion about the word discriminate. So discriminate, modern Americans today, in the age of progressivism, millions of Americans assume that word is synonymous with injustice or hate. Or hate, right? It's a bad thing to discriminate. And yet at its root, to discriminate simply means to choose.
Right.
To choose among alternatives. If you have several alternatives of anything and you say, well, I like this one better than the other, you've just discriminated. It used to be, people used to use that phrase. They'd say, oh, that's a man of discriminating tastes, meaning he has sampled a lot of food and a lot of drink, and he has a very refined palate. That was someone of he could choose because he had sampled so many things. Now we use this as a you're right, as a synonym for it. You're a hateful person if you discriminate, and yet all of us discriminate all day long, every day, because we're making choices between alternatives in all kinds of ways.
We have preferences. We have things that we like more than others, and we make choices, and those choices, it used to be you had discriminating taste, right? If you liked something really a lot more than others, if you liked, especially it was used for like a high-end restaurant or a high-end clothing store, things like that, you have discriminating taste. You know who doesn't look at anything, whether it's in cash or whether it's in a brick building with flowers and eggs and ovens? You know who doesn't look at those two things differently? The IRS. Because
it's true.
When the IRS comes along to send you your taxes at the end of the year, you pay a property tax bill.
Yeah.
You're not just paying tax on your income.
Yeah.
You're paying tax on everything you own.
Yep.
And the IRS is sitting there and they're looking at your home that is not even producing any value for you other than a place to live. And I mean, it produces personal value, but it's not producing any value to the community. But your home, the IRS comes along and says, that pile of bricks that you live in, that has value.
Yeah.
That is equivalent to cash in the bank.
You're going to pay us.
And you're going to pay us for it.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how they're so selective about you can't just we encourage you to discriminate with how you spend your cash.
Yeah.
But when we want to count what your personal wealth is so we can figure out what tax bracket to put you in, it doesn't matter what form that is. I don't care if it's Bitcoin. I don't care if it's cash. I don't care if it's gold. I don't care if it's property, real estate, ovens, something, anything else, computers. You have property and that has value, and we're gonna tax you for it.
I derailed you a little bit ago.
Well, that was where I was going to go with the second one.
I want to make sure you made the point you wanted to make.
I wanted to carry that through to even another step. And this one is really going to be where people start to think, okay, this is interesting. I'm going to make an argument right now that we have said that the government has basically just focused on who businesses do business with, who businesses trade with, right? And the government has generally stayed out of who individuals have to spend their money with. They might encourage, they might encourage that discrimination in a certain way, but they largely have stayed out of the business of telling individuals, of passing laws, telling individuals, you have to go shop at this store.
Yeah, government, as of today, they're not commanding us where we have to go spend our money.
I would argue over the last 2 years they have, and that's on vaccines.
Oh, yeah, great point.
You know, I mean, if you really think about it, what have they told us over the last 2 years? These private companies, there are 3 of them, Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah.
You better go spend your money with them.
Yeah.
Or else you can't be a part of society anymore.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden now government is starting to say, well, if we can do it to businesses, we can start doing it to people's personal spending. And all of a sudden now that door has been opened. We now have this precedent set.
And you know, all this comes back. So I want to anchor this in principle, one that's near and dear to our hearts at the Vino and Veritas Society, the idea of property. What property really means. I've almost come to dislike the term business. I love the idea of business. I love entrepreneurs and creative, productive people. Here's what I mean. When in modern progressive America today, when we talk about business, a whole lot of Americans think, oh, well, a business has all these obligations and burdens to do things that other people don't do. That's what I don't like about the word. I would rather we just talk about property owners, because in the case of any kind of transaction, what we call a business transaction, it's really property owners. And this is the point, and I think you were making this point, and I want to amplify it a little bit. In a trade, it's wrong to say one party is the seller and the other party is the buyer. Now that is the way most people, that's the way the law looks at it. Mm-hmm. This business is the seller, and the seller shall not discriminate, right? But the buyer can discriminate and go buy wherever he wants to. The truth is, when I'm driving around and I'm going to go shopping, I have some cash in my pocket. I'm a cash owner at that moment, and I am a seller. I am looking to sell my cash. And the question is, what will I sell it for? And I walk down the halls at the aisles at the grocery store, and I let the grocery store make offers to me. And they say, hey, Tom, here's a loaf of bread. Yep. We'll trade this bread for your cash, right? Or over here is here's a pound of hamburger. We'll trade, right? They're making offers to me, and I get to decide what I want to trade my cash for.
They're making those offers, and they're strategic about it. I mean, let's not pretend that this is just, okay,
that's why they put the milk in the back of the store, right?
They put milk in the back of the store. It's why certain things are on the top shelf and certain things are on the bottom shelf.
That's right.
They are strategic about understanding that we are trying to convince you to use your cash in this store in this way and spend as much of it as possible.
And so this is something I think it's hard for some people to get their minds around. Yet it's absolutely true. Next time you're in the store, don't think of yourself as a consumer or a buyer. Think of yourself as a seller. You have something to sell, money. You've got money to sell. And the question is someone going to make an offer of something that you're willing to sell your money for, that you're willing to trade? Mm-hmm. In a transaction, both parties are sellers and both parties are buyers. Because they're making a trade. And that's why the trade should be mutually voluntary. That's why we should not have laws telling you, Dave, or anybody else, or Jack Phillips, or anybody else, that you shall engage in some sort of trade, some sort of exchange that you don't want to. Now, here's the big, and by the way, I carry that critique all the way up. So the granddaddy of all public accommodation laws is Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Right.
And here I wanted to head off another complaint that is often raised. People will say, yeah, but hold on. If you're opening a business to the public, you have an obligation to serve anybody who walks through the door, to do business with anybody who wants to do business. But many businesses don't want to be public accommodations. They don't declare themselves to be public accommodations. These are laws passed by politicians saying, we are defining your business as a public accommodation.
Right.
And therefore, we're telling you who you're going to do trade. They don't want to be public accommodations. And so if a business owner wants to declare his establishment, his property to be a place where he accommodates the public, he certainly is free to make that known. But if he doesn't want it to be a public accommodation, then it shouldn't be that. Now, these laws, starting with the 1962 Civil Rights Act and Title 2 of 1964 Civil Rights Act, these were passed as a response to some very dark chapters in American history.
Yes.
The problem comes in that period between the Civil War, well, really the century, between the end of the Civil War, it's almost 100 years exactly, very close. Civil War concludes in 1865. The Civil Rights Act is passed in 1964, a century later. And in that intervening time, you had the rise of some real ugliness in the United States. Jim Crow laws, which were typically state laws, often municipal codes and ordinances. Mm-hmm. That's where you got the things like white and black drinking fountains, white and black, different restrooms for black people, things like this. And that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it were Democrats, and I'm going to call it like it is here because these were all Democrats, who would put hoods on their heads and show up at somebody's house in the middle of the night with torches blazing and guns, and they would do horrific injustices. They would rape, they would murder, they would burn people's houses down. It was the Ku Klux Klan and other groups like this. It truly was a campaign of domestic terrorism, violent, murderous domestic terrorism. And in those ugly chapters of American history, what black people were demanding in places where the Ku Klux Klan was doing all those terrible things, and it was, I don't want to in any way sell this short or be dismissive. It was truly horrific, not least of which, in many instances, when a black family was being targeted by the Klan or someone like that, they couldn't turn to the local sheriff because very often the local sheriff was part of the Klan, the prosecutor, the judges, that they were all in the very government entity that is supposed to protect rights was actively engaged in violating rights in a terrible way.
And violating foundational laws of natural rights.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you can make all of these laws in Title II and have the 1964 Civil Rights Act and everything else. These people were willing to murder. These people were willing to rape. These are not, it's not
which were all crimes.
Right.
At the time.
These are actual crimes. Yeah. It's not like, oh, well, we're going to do everything short of what's a violation of the law. They had totally dismissed that black people in this country had a right, had a right to the equal protection of the law.
Your point is actually really important. If I'm a black man being terrorized in Atlanta, Georgia in 1930, Congress passing a law controlling how people run their own businesses, that doesn't protect me from being murdered and my wife being raped and my children being lynched by the Ku Klux Klan in the middle of the night. There are already laws against murder and rape and arson.
Exactly.
And the Klan is perfectly willing to just ignore those laws and go engage in criminal behavior anyway. And in those periods, it's interesting. I think the public imagination focuses things on like the white-owned lunch counter and the white bigot, the racist who didn't want to let a black man come and sit at the lunch counter and eat lunch. And the truth is, there were not large numbers of black men and women who wanted to go eat at lunch counters owned by white bigots who hated blacks. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to. And I suspect it's probably not that much different. Right? You're Jewish, Dave.
Yeah.
Are there large numbers of Jews who want to go eat at a restaurant owned by someone who hates Jews? No. Why would you? Of course you don't want to be there. Same thing with black people. They don't want to go eat at restaurants owned by people who hate blacks.
I mean, we're seeing that still to this day, right? And you see it with the BDS movement, the anti-Israel BDS movement. When I know a company is advocating for the BDS movement, I won't buy their products. And I just go look for an alternative. I want to help an alternative grow.
You don't want a law that commands that business owner to offer a service or a product to you.
Right.
And this is my point. What black during the peak of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan and democratic terrorism across the country, What black men and women wanted was to be left alone. That's what they wanted. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to go eat at the lunch counter owned by the white bigot. They wanted to open their own lunch counter, and they wanted to be secure in their property.
Right.
That was it. And here's this, and this is a story that is not well enough known in American history. In all the annals of human history, American blacks have to be among the most resilient of all people anywhere, because in the face of the terrorism and the Jim Crow and all of that, you know what they did? They did go and they opened their own lunch counters, and they opened their own restaurants and hotels and banks. They built schools. In fact, they worked with a Jewish entrepreneur, and they built 5,000 schools for black kids across the Ku Klux Klan dominated South.
Right.
And they still went and built a bunch of schools, a bunch of little kids.
Schools.
The Rosenwald schools. They wanted to be left alone and secure in their property. That's it. That is it. And what this really is, I'm going to give a little teaser here because we're going to do some more. We're going to do some more work in the future on the myth of the switch of the parties in the 1960s. There was a switch. It was not a switch between the parties.
No,
it was a switch of tactics on the part of Democrats. The Democratic Party goes from enslaving and then terrorizing blacks to using black oppression. And I want to be really clear about this. Democrats who had oppressed blacks, terrorized them, tortured them, used to enslave them, those same Democrats use black oppression as an excuse to justify Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act,
right,
and all these state-based so-called public accommodation laws, which expands government control over private property, over private business. It's as if I keep beating you every day, right?
Yep.
And every day I'm giving you a bloody lip and black eye and all, and you're like, stop beating me. And finally, after many years, I say, okay, Dave doesn't want to be beaten up. So the only way that is going to happen is if I control everyone else's property, right? Everybody else has to pay me, and I got to control their property so that I stop beating Dave.
And if anybody wants to know the moment of that switch, there's a colorful quote from LBJ that describes, and I'm not going to use it because I don't want it on. I don't want me saying it on camera.
Well, he's talking about black people, and he says, "I'll have them voting,
yes,
for another 200 years."
Right,
but he doesn't say them.
Right.
Yep.
And that's just proof of that moment is that's when that switch happened.
That same, by the way, Lyndon Johnson, who ends up signing. Maybe we'll have to save this for another day. This whole story of how the Civil Rights Act came to be. He is president when it passes Congress, and he does sign it. And he does say, as he's signing it, well, this will make sure that black Americans are going to be voting for Democrats for 200 years. That same man, Lyndon Johnson, a mere 7 years earlier when he was in the United States Senate, and the Republicans had floated a civil rights bill, an actual civil rights bill to ensure that blacks could vote and things like this, actually participate in civil governance. He made a comment. He's not voting for another Negro bill.
Right.
But he didn't use the word Negro. Right. He used the other N word. Right. Not voting for another one of those bills.
And Joe Biden was around there somewhere at that time as well.
Of course.
So I think actually next week, as we circle back on this, there is a very, very interesting history to all of this when you're talking about presidents and presidential candidates. And that might be one place for us to start next week is talking about whether it's Barry Goldwater or Lyndon Johnson or Joe Biden or Ronald Reagan. There is a whole lot to discuss about what was going on in the chase for the executive office or within the Oval Office itself.
Well, maybe we'll pick this up with Barry Goldwater. He's sort of a key figure because he challenges Lyndon Johnson in the 1964 election.
Right.
I have a personal connection to this because at the Republican National Convention, Barry Goldwater gives a famous speech, and that famous speech was penned by my professor, by Harry Jaffa, and so maybe this is and Goldwater famously opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act for precisely the reasons that we're talking about.
And what's interesting is I've talked often about my affinity for Ronald Reagan's "A Time for Choosing" speech at that very same convention.
It's right.
And Harry Jaffa wrote this incredible speech for Barry Goldwater that got overshadowed by what I would call probably the best political speech delivered in our nation since Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting. That convention was so pivotal, and the Republican Party losing to LBJ because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, in large part. It's amazing where things went.
And we need to say more, because what we're saying here, I mean, we really are, we're defending the American founding principles of liberty in a very clear, principled way. And an implication of our argument is that we should not be using the Civil Rights Act as sort of the moral barometer that anyone who stands with that is good and anyone who opposes it is bad. Now, there are actually some real problems, some deep-seated problems with the 64 Civil Rights Act and all these state-based public accommodation laws. And we should flesh this out as members of the Vino and Veritas Society.
To be guardians of the American idea means to really think about all of these things, even if they seem good. You've really got to think it through, and that's what it means to be a guardian in the Vino Veritas Society.
No sumos custodes.
Until next time.